of things? Or is the church something distinct? Or, conversely, a different political model, do I need to be a monarchist, someone who believes monarchy is the best form of government because I worship a king? Jesus Christ is the king. So do I need to be a monarchist because Jesus is king? Or can we have wiggle room? Liberal democracy in some areas of life and worshiping Jesus and recognizing the importance of a monarchy in other areas of life. I think this is the problem that our conference is drawing attention to, and it's become particularly pressing in the United States, and because of the footprint the United States has in the world, it's become a problem for parts of the world, unfortunately as well, other parts of the world. But we have an impasse in the United States, I think, in part because of this all of me Christianity. Ever since the 1980s, the typical approach to religion and politics assumed a partisan perspective. Either the public square welcomes churches, or it excludes churches. It's either or. Either religious convictions are private, or they legitimately inform the aspirations that guide public life. In other words, no middle ground exists. If Christians are going to participate meaningfully in public life, the wall between the church and state, or the separation between church and state, has to come down, or at least gates have to be added to allow for passage back and forth. And this is, again, a way that's become common among Christians in the United States of looking at the relationship between politics and theology, or politics and the church. And in this view, Christians and secular liberals are made for each other. As much as evangelicals try to say all areas of life belong to God, and so religion should not be excluded in any way from public affairs, secularists see that such divine intervention can likely end up dispossessing those who do not believe in the God of evangelical Protestants. So again, you have a major conflict going on here with two views that are hard to reconcile, either a secular view or a view of Christianity that means it has to inform everything. So again, another way of putting it is that you are either obedient to God in all walks of life, or you are selling out your faith when you are not obedient to God in all walks of life. And as Dr. Lee mentioned earlier, or Pastor Lee, I don't know what you prefer. So again, another way of putting it is that you are obedient to God in all walks of life, or you are selling out your faith when you are not. I'm not speaking. What happened?
That's the Holy Spirit.
Okay. So, I mean, what lies behind the question that Pastor Lee mentioned earlier is what happens if the Bible doesn't really talk about tax policy? What happens, you want to be obedient in all walks of life, but what if the Bible doesn't tell you how to be obedient? Say if you're teaching English grammar in high school, or if you're constructing a road, or if you're resolving a strike, or if you're deciding the best treatment for cancer. What if the Bible doesn't speak in those areas? What do I do as a Christian? I want to be obedient in all of life. And I do think that confessional Protestantism, Reformed Protestantism, offers a way around this impasse. It provides a way for believers to live within the lanes that do separate the realms of church and state. By looking for religious significance not in this world, but in the world to come, not in the public square, but in our Sunday morning worship, confessional Protestantism lowers the stakes for public life while still affirming politics' divinely ordained purpose, meaning that God has ordained the magistrate to rule in this world to maintain public order. So it does have real value, but it's not of a divine nature in the same way that the church's work is of eternal significance. Politics is neither ultimately good nor inherently evil. Politics is merely a divine way of trying to restrain evil in this world until Jesus returns, so that the church can pursue her holy calling. And part of what I'm trying to say here is that what the church does is far more consequential than anything that government does. The church is engaged with eternal realities. The state is merely engaged with temporal affairs. So sometimes I like to try to lower the stakes of politics by saying it's sort of akin to dog catching or plumbing. Catching dogs and making sure we don't have leaks in our plumbing are really important parts of our life. But it's not like it's some kind of way of bringing in the kingdom of God. We don't attach that kind of significance to those ordinary areas of life, even though they're legitimate. And so we should probably back away from trying to give to politics some kind of spiritual or sacred or redemptive significance. And if you've observed American presidents, the last two, it might be a lot easier to reduce the significance of politics, because I would hope you wouldn't want to hold up either President Trump or President Biden as exemplars of some kind of great political vision and rule. So, by way of introduction, I'll just appeal to a writer whose views I have sometimes used when writing about religion and politics. This is a sociologist, Daniel Bell, who is, I believe, now deceased, recently though. He was a New York intellectual, a sociologist who taught at Columbia University and Harvard University, and he wrote for important magazines that were associated with what we call in the United States neoconservatism. Neocons get a bad reputation because of their foreign policy, and I would probably share that view, but they also did a lot of important work in thinking about public policy in the United States. And in his 1978 foreword to his book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, Daniel Bell described himself this way: a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. And then I have a quote from him here explaining that. Many persons might find this statement puzzling, assuming that if a person is a radical in one realm, he is a radical in all others. And conversely, if he is conservative in one realm, then he must be conservative in others as well. But, he goes on to argue, modern capitalist society does not permit such ideological consistency. According to Bell, such an assumption misreads both sociologically and morally the nature of living in a modern society. So Bell was not a Christian. He was Jewish American, although I don't think he was an observant Jew. But in our case, getting closer to home, he was describing something like the Christian J. Gresham Machen, who is in the subtitle of my talk. So I'll move now to J. Gresham Machen. Who was he? Well, he lived between 1881 and 1937. He studied the classics as an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins University in his hometown of Baltimore. He also pursued a master's in the classics there. He struggled with vocation for a time. He didn't know what to do. His father was a prominent attorney in Baltimore, but he thought about going into law. He thought about going into banking. Eventually, he went to seminary as a way of sort of putting an end to what to do and wasting his parents' money. And at seminary, he discovered that there was this overlap between the study of the Greek New Testament and also the study of the ancient classical world. And so he found a home in studying the New Testament. He did a year of study after Princeton Seminary in Germany, and then he joined the faculty at Princeton in 1906. And then he taught at Princeton Seminary between 1906 and 1929, he became very much involved in so-called fundamentalist controversy in the American churches more generally, but also in the Presbyterian Church in the 1920s. He was a leading conservative in those debates. He wrote a book in 1923 that many people are paying attention to this year because it's the 100th anniversary of the book, Christianity and Liberalism. If you've not read it, I'd encourage you to do it. It's very accessible, very straightforward. Machen, as a well-trained classicist, could write very clearly, but it's also a great defense of the faith in light of Protestant liberalism, which was overtaking the churches. But I still think, and people who have written about the book and talked about the book this year because of the anniversary, also seem to recognize that the book still has great relevance for our time. So, having mentioned that book, I should also say, by the way, so the controversies in which Machen participated led to the founding of Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia in 1929. He broke away from Princeton to form that seminary. And then further battles in the Presbyterian Church in the 1930s over liberalism in the Foreign Missions Office and on the mission field led him to further controversy with the church, and the church brought him to trial, and he was forced out of the church. So he and other conservatives founded the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in 1936, roughly 6 months before he died. But again, having mentioned Christianity and liberalism, and referring to that book, I think I can safely say that Machen was Orthodox. We're just going to start with that, so that my title today is Conservative in Religion. We can assume that Machen was conservative in religion by virtue of Christianity and liberalism. I'm not going to try to prove that here. But what made Machen a liberal in politics? And by liberal, I should say, what this means is really the American founding, the American political tradition, where you have three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Of course, the Americans didn't invent this. They inherited this from all sorts of sources in the West and the ancients. But you have those checks and balances. You have protection of rights for citizens. You have representative government. So that's what I'm assuming is liberal, the American Revolution and the American founding. Yes, it did involve separation of church and state, but we can get into that. So I'm going to give you some examples now of some of Machen's political views. For somebody who was as active in church life and engaged in the politics of the church, he also spent a fair amount of time writing about politics, writing letters to editors, writing articles for magazines and newspapers and the like, and even sometimes testifying before government officials. So if we wanted to identify Machen politically, we would, in the United States, we would call him a libertarian. That is, somebody who believes in small government, that government should be small and should protect the rights of people, of citizens, to engage in their lives freely as long as those lives don't hurt other people. So one of the examples of Machen's politics comes in jaywalking laws. I don't know if South Africa, if Cape Town has jaywalking laws. In Western United States, you can get tickets in places like Los Angeles if you cross the street, not at the corner, but in between the blocks, the cross streets, and also if you cross the street when you don't have the light telling you you can walk. And it was one of Machen's trips to Los Angeles that alerted him to this problem. He thought it was awful to have jaywalking laws. One of the reasons was that he thought basically it just cleared the streets for drivers. They didn't have to worry about anybody on the street. They would just go and not have to worry about pedestrians. He thought that wasn't really a good thing to encourage among drivers. But he also, Philadelphia started passing jaywalking laws in the 1930s, and Machen liked to walk from his apartment on Chancellor Street over to Westminster Seminary on Pine Street, maybe a 3 or 4 block walk, and he would walk cat-a-corner across the street depending on the traffic. And he was often had his head in a book. He had these short editions of the classics. He would be reading those books as he walked, but I mean, he never got hit by a car, so he must have been somewhat careful. But that was one of the things that he thought was too much in government involvement. Jaywalking laws was too much. It was a way of sort of the nanny state, as it were, or big government trying to protect citizens. He thought it was paternalistic, that people really were capable of taking care of themselves and didn't need government to protect them. So Machen actually testified before the city council in Philadelphia in 1931 on that. Another instance of Machen's politics, another similarly libertarian view, came with fingerprinting. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a lot of gangster elements that arose in American cities thanks to Prohibition. There's a lot of illegal trade in alcohol. And one of the ways that some federal authorities thought about trying to restrict the gangster element was to have everyone be fingerprinted. That way you could document where people were. Well, again, Machen saw this as a major overreach by government trying to interfere in the liberties of people's lives. He didn't want to live like Europeans did, where you'd have to travel around with a passport and constantly prove your national identity and your legitimate standing. So that was another small example of Machen's politics. A bigger one from that era, as I mentioned, Prohibition, was a law passed in the United States in an amendment to the Constitution of all things, banning the sale and distribution of alcohol from 1919 until 1933. And Machen actually suffered for his opposition to Prohibition. The church had many votes, the Presbyterian Church had many votes supporting Prohibition. In 1926, the administrators at Princeton Seminary nominated him for a promotion to teach apologetics at the seminary. Well, word got to the General Assembly deliberating on Machen's appointment that he had voted in his presbytery at the prior spring meeting. He had voted no against a resolution in favor of Prohibition. These were basically just saying, yes, the church supports this. Yes, the church supports this. That would be the motion. Machen would vote no. Well, that word got to Assembly that he voted that way. And because the people who teach apologetics, both at Princeton and still at Westminster, you not only teach apologetics, but you also teach ethics. Well, how could somebody teach ethics who voted no against Prohibition? This man must not have morals if he would not support Prohibition. And the reason why Machen thought the church shouldn't support Prohibition was that the church could declare, and had every right to declare, that drunkenness is a sin. That's what the church should do. But the church has no data from Scripture to know what the federal policy or state policy should be with regard to how to regulate alcohol in some way. So Machen thought government should stay out of this, but also the church should stay out of it. In fact, Machen's brother, there was for a time an anti-prohibition party on the ballot in Maryland. Machen's brother ran on that party ticket in the congressional elections in 1926 and lost. Another issue that Machen wrote about was prayer and Bible reading in public schools. I don't know what the practice is here in South Africa or what it has been, but I'm old enough to have gone to public school when there was still prayer and Bible reading in public schools. And if you ever want to, well, I won't say that now. So I had prayer and Bible reading first grade, second grade. It was gone because the Supreme Court ruled that prayer and Bible reading in public schools was unconstitutional. And there were many Christians, Roman Catholic and Protestant, who objected to that. They thought that that was a betrayal of this public institution and the importance of religion in public schools. But all the way back in the 1920s, Machen was opposed to prayer and Bible reading in public schools. On the religious grounds, he argued that this was just kind of giving students the morality of Christianity without any of the theology. So you were giving a very skewed view of Christianity by having prayer and Bible reading in public schools. So that was the religious angle. But he also recognized that there were people who went to public schools who weren't Protestant or weren't Christian. So what do Jews, what do Mormons, Roman Catholics also objected to prayer and Bible reading because the schools weren't using the approved Roman Catholic version of the Bible, the Douay version. So Machen also recognized religious freedom was at issue here, and he thought the better way was to keep prayer and Bible reading out of public schools. So he was also an advocate, as that example indicates, he was an advocate for religious freedom for Roman Catholics, for instance. He said, if we want the freedom to promulgate the Protestant faith, Roman Catholics have every right to also promulgate their faith. And that's what religious freedom should mean. He even argued, as much as he hated communism, and I'll give you an example of this, he argued that communists who wanted to start private schools in New York City, which they were trying to do in the 1930s, Machen argued they have every right to try to start their own schools. So that's how wide his libertarianism went. All of these examples, though, I think are indicative of Machen's fear of government becoming too large and too powerful. He believed the American founding was designed to keep government in check, and one of the reasons for that was a very Reformed or Calvinistic view that human beings are inherently sinful, and you have to be careful giving human beings power. So having constitutional provisions keeping power in check is a good thing. So let me give you a little bit more of his actual reasoning rather than my trying to summarize things on two other issues that agitated Machen quite considerably. One of these was whether to create a federal Department of Education. That federal Department of Education, I believe, was not founded in the United States until 1978. Machen testified before Congress in 1926 opposing it. And it's not because he testified that they decided not to do it, don't get me wrong. But it is the case that it took until 1978 for this federal agency to be formed. And I'll give you a couple paragraphs here from an essay that Machen wrote on the necessity of the Christian school. So he's arguing for the value of Christian schools, also making the point about the dangers of having too much government involvement in education. He writes in this essay, "Let us return to the educators and their general demand either for a federal Department of Education or for federal aid to the states. Such demands are in the interests of uniformity in the sphere of education. There should be, it is said, a powerful coordinating agency in education to set up standards and encourage the production of something like a system. But what shall we say of such an aim? I have no hesitation from my part in saying that I am dead opposed to it. Uniformity in education, it seems to me, is one of the worst calamities into which any people can fall." So notice here this idea of government leading to standards, which leads to uniformity, is a major part of Machen's argument. He goes on, there are, it is true, some fears in which uniformity is a good thing. It is a good thing, for example, in the making of Ford cars. You've heard of that line of cars. In the making of a Ford car, uniformity is the great end of the activity. That end is indeed not always attained. Sometimes a Ford car possesses entirely too much individuality. My observation was in the heroic days before the invention of self-starters, when a Ford was still a Ford and you had to crank it from the front, that sometimes a Ford car would start and sometimes it would not start. And if it would not start, there was no use whatever in giving it any encouraging advice. But although uniformity was not always perfectly attained, the aim at least was to attain it. The purpose of the whole activity was that one Ford car should be just as much like every other Ford car as it could possibly be made. But what is good for a Ford car is not always good for a human being, for the simple reason that a Ford car is a machine while a human being is a person. Our modern pedagogic experts seem to deny this distinction, and that is one place where our quarrel with them comes in. When you're dealing with human beings, standardization is the last thing you ought to seek. Uniformity of education under one central government department would be a very great calamity. We are constantly told, he goes on, it is true that there ought to be an equal opportunity for all children in the United States. Therefore, it is said, federal aid ought to be given to backward states. But what shall we say about this business of equal opportunity? I will tell you, I am entirely opposed to it. One thing is perfectly clear. If all the children in the United States have equal opportunities, no child will have an opportunity that is worth very much. If parents cannot have the great incentive of providing high and special educational advantages for their own children, then we shall have in this country a drab and soul-killing uniformity, and there will be scarcely any opportunity for anyone to get out of the miserable rut. The thing is really quite clear. Every lover of human freedom, a libertarian, remember, ought to oppose with all his might the giving of federal aid to the schools of this country, for federal aid in the long run inevitably means federal control, and federal control by a centralized and irresponsible bureaucracy comes with it. And control by such a bureaucracy means the death of everything that might make this country great. Against this soul-killing collectivism in education, the Christian school, like the private school, stands as an emphatic protest. In doing so, it is no real enemy to the public schools. On the contrary, the only way in which a state-controlled school can be kept even relatively healthy is through the absolutely free possibility of competition by private schools and church schools. If it once becomes monopolistic, it is the most effective engine of tyranny and intellectual stagnation that has yet been devised. So one reason why I favor the Christian school, Machen writes, I favor it in the interests of American liberty. So it's quite striking to see that Machen is an advocate for Christian schools, something that endeared him to Dutch American Reformed Protestants who were great believers in Christian day schools. Machen had great affinity with those Dutch Americans because he was an advocate for the Christian school, but he was also an advocate for it because it went along with libertarian arguments about keeping government out of control of all education. Let me give you another example. This comes from economics, and this is one time where he was debating a Dutch American Calvinist over socialism, and especially over the New Deal in the 1930s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented a number of economic policies and tried to get congressional support for those remedies to alleviate the economic conditions out of the Great Depression. And Machen, somebody wrote an article in response to something he wrote, and he wrote then a response to this professor who taught economics at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And this goes to the issue of a specific congressional legislation or policy that was going to have implications for the country. Machen wrote, one thing is perfectly clear. If we do not want Congress to exercise certain powers, then we must not grant it the right to exercise those powers. The lesson of history is really too plain. We cannot possibly unlearn it. Indeed, the whole notion that Congress may be trusted is contrary to the basic notion of the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution is essentially a system of checks and balances. It carefully guards each of the departments of the federal government from encroachments by the others. It carefully guards the states from encroachments by the federal government. And it carefully guards individual rights from the encroachments by any government. Jealous distrust by governmental powers is at the heart and core of our institutions. Those institutions, he goes on, were not an arbitrary invention of the framers of the Constitution, but were the culmination of a long and glorious history. Professor Vanden Bosch, Army Vander Bosch was his name, seems to regard the defense of those institutions as being reaction. I am compelled to disagree with him. I am compelled to call it progress, and I am compelled to regard the growing tendency in our day to disregard basic human rights in the interests of an all-powerful state as being at bottom nothing in the world but a reversion to savagery. And I can't imagine what Machen would have done if he would have had any hair left in his head during the pandemic lockdowns. If someone accuses me at this point of being an alarmist, I would just bid such a one to open his eyes and look out upon the countries of the world today. Russia, this is 1933 he's writing. Russia stands under the most crushing tyranny that history has ever seen. Italy and Germany are now under a regime which, despite all superficial differences, is essentially the same as the system that prevails in Russia. And then at the same time, when all over the world these elemental forces of evil are mightily at work, these forces that have given us Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler, at such a time, Professor Vanden Bosch is telling us that Congress can be trusted. I am bound to say that a man would have to be blind not to see that the forces which in this country have gotten us our present vast bureaucracy, a bureaucracy to which yet vaster additions will be made if this so-called child labor amendment is ratified, are exactly the same forces as those which have led to the destruction of all liberty in Russia and Italy and Germany. He goes on in this article then to debate a Christian understanding of aid and welfare versus one that is socialist in nature. And I'll just conclude with this. Again, I'm not asking you to agree with Machen. I'm not asking you to become a libertarian like Americans. This is just an example of the way that someone tried to relate Christian orthodoxy with liberal politics. So this is what he writes at the end of this article about the differences between socialism and Christianity. What at bottom is the difference between the ethics of socialism and the ethics of Christianity? In some ways, the two look very much alike. Both are seeking to relieve creature distress, and both require men of wealth, at least under certain circumstances, to give up their wealth and become poor. But the socialist seeks to accomplish that by force, and the Christian seeks to accomplish it by love. There lies the profound difference. The socialist says to the man who possesses this world's goods, quote, "We intend to compel you to distribute your wealth as we see fit. We should regard ourselves as degraded if we received it from you as a gift, but we intend to take it from you by force," end of quote. And then Machen goes on. The Christian, on the other hand, says to the man of wealth, or rather to the man who has any amount, large or small, of this world's goods, quote, "The Lord loves a cheerful giver. Will you not have compassion upon those less fortunate than yourself? Will you not take any possible sting of degradation from the receivers of such a gift by letting your gift be prompted truly by love," end of quote. I think, Machen goes on to write, there is a deep-seated conflict between these two views of life. I do not think that the conflict between them can permanently be concealed. So those are just ways in which Machen's politics played out in different settings child labor amendments, socialism, jaywalking, prohibition, and the like. Again, these are merely examples. They're not models that any of us has to follow to be a good Christian. They show how Machen was a political liberal while also being an Orthodox Protestant. And again, it's quite striking that he's taking these views, he's taking these positions, while he himself is in the Presbyterian Church insisting that ministers must conform their views, restriction of their freedom of thought, they must conform their views to the Westminster Confession and Catechism. So Machen is not a libertarian in the church. He's for intolerance in the church, and he would say that. But when it comes to civil society, he's for as much tolerance as is possible. So if there is a norm here at all in Machen's example, it is this: be an Orthodox Christian and have convictions about politics. But I would add, don't try to make those two views conform. Some things in life are merely political. Some things in life are explicitly Christian. So Machen offers that example to us. So let me come close to a final point. I guess this is the penultimate point, winding toward a conclusion, though. Do I have to have Machen's politics to be Orthodox? Of course the answer is no. You don't have to share his politics. But I'll raise the stakes. Do you need to have John Calvin's views on politics to be Orthodox? Do you need to have Zacharias Ursinus' views on politics to be Orthodox? Zacharias Ursinus is one of the authors of the Heidelberg Catechism. Remember that the political systems at the time in 16th century Europe were not liberal. There was no separation of church and state. The model for both Protestant and Roman Catholic societies was Christendom. Church and government should cooperate to make a Christian society. That was the norm out of which the Protestant Reformation emerged. And you see this in the Belgic Confession of Faith, Article 36. I was also thinking about using an example from the Westminster Confession of Faith on the civil magistrate, which is written about 80 years later. I don't know what the breakdown here is, my audience, between Presbyterians and Reformed, but I'm sticking with the Belgic Confession. 1563, Article 36 reads, and my host is Reformed, so I've got to go with my host. Article 36, we believe that our good God, because of the depravity of mankind, has appointed kings, princes, and magistrates, willing that the world should be governed by certain laws and policies, to the end that the dissoluteness of men might be restrained, and all things carried on among them with good order and decency. For this purpose, God has placed the sword in the hand of the magistrate for the punishment of evildoers and for the defense of them that do well. I think that view of civil authority is widely shared by pre-modern and modern Christians, that God has given the sword to the civil magistrate to punish the wicked and to reward the good and to maintain civil order. But Article 36 goes on, and this is where it gets maybe a little bit difficult for us modern Christians, modern Protestants. For their office, the magistrate's office, is not only to have regard unto and watch for the welfare of civil society, but also to maintain the true sacred ministry, and thus may remove and prevent all idolatry and false worship, that the kingdom of Antichrist may be thus destroyed and the kingdom of Christ promoted. So not only does the magistrate have the power to, say, enforce the second table of the Ten Commandments, from honoring parents down to envy, although I'd like to see them try to enforce envy. But also the first table of the law, meaning one true God, worship the Lord's Day, etc. This is where many Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries found the political solution to their time. The state should enforce the first table of the law. and make sure that Jews, Roman Catholics, there were no Mormons there then, but Mormons, be suppressed. They're not allowed to carry on their worship. There were laws restricting freedom of worship in Calvin's Geneva and John Winthrop's Boston, the Puritan capital in Massachusetts. Article 36 goes on to say, the magistrates must therefore countenance the preaching of the word of the gospel everywhere, that God may be honored and worshiped by everyone as he commands in his word. So again, the civil magistrate has an obligation to promote the true religion and to make sure his subjects, her subjects, are in the true churches, not in any false church. Now, someone came along in the 19th century by the name of Abraham Kuyper and opposed this part of the Belgic Confession, Article 36. Abraham Kuyper, you may know that name. I don't know how widely. I assume he's pretty well known in South Africa, probably better known than in the United States, but important newspaper columnist, minister of the Reformed Church, founder of the Free University, prime minister in the early 20th century. He wrote this about Article 36. We oppose this language in Article 36 out of complete conviction, prepared to bear the consequences of our convictions, even when we will be denounced and mocked on that account as unreformed. We would rather be considered not reformed and insist that men ought not to kill heretics, than that we are left with the reformed name as the prize for assigning the shedding of blood of heretics. And of course, you may remember from some time in your education that Michael Servetus, a heretic who denied the doctrine of the Trinity, was executed in Geneva for holding those views. He would have been executed anywhere else as well. He happened to get caught by the Geneva authorities, but still, that was one of the penalties for having heretical views on something like the Trinity and the deity of Christ. Kuyper goes on, it is our conviction that the examples which are found in the Old Testament in support of the view of the magistrate in the Belgic Confession, that the examples which are found in the Old Testament are of no force for us because the infallible indication of what was or was not heretical, which was present at that time, is now lacking. In other words, they had prophets, we don't. That's one way of looking at that. He also says, the Lord and the apostles never called upon the help of the magistrate to kill with the sword the one who deviated from the truth, even in connection with such horrible heretics as defiled the congregation in Corinth. Paul mentions nothing of this idea, and it cannot be concluded from any particular word in the New Testament that in the days when particular revelation should cease, that the rooting out of heretics with the sword is the obligation of magistrates. And one more reason Kuyper gave for revising the Belgic Confession was this on Article 36. This proposition supposed that the magistrate is in a position to judge the difference between truth and heresy, an office of grace which, as appears from the history of 18 centuries, is not granted by the Holy Spirit, but is withheld. Little elbow in the ribs there. He's making a pretty funny joke if you didn't notice. For a magistrate to oppose heresy, a magistrate has to know the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. And 1,800 years of Christendom in the West was not littered with all sorts of magistrates who actually knew orthodoxy from heresy. So why would you ever want to give power of suppressing heresy to someone like Donald Trump, to someone like Joe Biden? Maybe that's not a good way to go. But it's not clear that Donald Trump or Joe Biden would actually hold office in 16th or 17th century Europe. So maybe that's a little bit anachronistic. So this is what Christian Reformed Church of North America revised the Belgic Confession, Article 36, to read. We believe that because of the depravity of the human race, our good God has ordained kings, princes, and civil officers He wants the world to be governed by laws and policies so that human lawlessness may be restrained and that everything may be conducted in good order among human beings. For that purpose, he has placed the sword in the hands of the government to punish evil and protect the good. And being called in this manner to contribute to the advancement of a society that is pleasing to God, the civil rulers have the task, subject to God's law, of removing every obstacle to the preaching of the gospel and to every aspect of divine worship. So they've made a switch here. Instead of suppressing bad religion, the magistrate should protect the good religion, at least. The Westminster Confession revisions of this same part of their confession talk about the magistrate protecting the religious views of all of their subjects, not just Christians. The revised article goes on to say they should do this, the magistrate should do this, while completely refraining from every tendency toward exercising absolute authority and while functioning in the sphere entrusted to them with the means belonging to them. Perhaps a little bit long-winded way of saying government should stay in its lane when it comes to religion. But conversely, the church should stay in its lane when it comes to politics. So, modern Christians, the differences between 1563 or 61, is it 61 Belgic? Yeah. Belgic Confession and 1958 Christian Reformed Church, North America. Modern Christians came to understand that in the modern world, the church and government operate in different spheres. There's, of course, overlap on morality. It's hard to deny that. But still, they operate in different spheres. And the major reason for that is the setting of modern society. There is remarkable religious, intellectual, ethnic, racial diversity in our societies that includes believers and unbelievers. So in modern liberal society, all of those people have rights under the law. And therefore, it makes no sense for Christians to seek a Christian government, a Christian nation, or to seek Christian politics. Doesn't mean that Christians can't be engaged in politics. It just means that they have to do so, it seems to me, the way that Machen did, by trying to find those policies, those laws, those politicians, those parties that are most compatible with your convictions as a Christian. So again, you don't have to be orthodox to have Machen's politics, but you also don't have to be orthodox to have Kuyper's politics or John Calvin's politics. Part of Reformed Orthodoxy, part of Presbyterian Orthodoxy is not having the right politics. So, let me finish with this, and I'll appeal to the Apostle Paul, who's already been appealed to by both Machen and Kuyper. In 1 Timothy 2, the Apostle writes to Timothy, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Now, I don't want to attach too much weight to those two verses, but that idea of thinking about the Christian life and thinking about what's good for the church and her ministry, thinking about a quiet and peaceful life seems to me to be pretty good categories. So a peaceful and quiet life means that we can worship, we can rear our children, we can be faithful to our spouses, we can live out our vocations, we can love our neighbors in all sorts of ways. And if magistrates can do that, and if we can pray for them to do that, that's a really good thing, especially considering the nature of the fall and how all of us are turned inward on ourselves apart from grace. Now, what political system would allow us to have that kind of quiet and peaceful life? Well, in Paul's day, Paul thought the Roman Empire was compatible with that. But that doesn't mean today that we want to bring back the Roman Empire because Paul was comfortable with it. In Guido de Brie's way, the author of the Belgic Confession, the ideal was a Christian monarch. Same was true for Presbyterians in 17th century Scotland. That you could, the best way to live a quiet and peaceful life was if you had a Christian monarch and a national church that was reformed. Okay, that may be true in 17th century Scotland, although it didn't really lead to a very peaceful decade in the 1640s. The English had a big hand in that too. And then one other example is a federated republic, which is what the United States is. Machen thought that you could live a quiet and peaceful life with a government that adhered to the kind of measures provided in the Constitution of the United States. So one way of trying to summarize here is that the politics of a nation and the politics of Christians will depend on the setting and the circumstances in which we live. There's no one plan for every Christian church or for every Christian person. We pray for rulers who will order society in a way that allows us to live quiet and peaceful lives. But we don't pray for rulers to make up the rules so that we know we have them telling us what a quiet and peaceful life is. God tells us what a quiet and peaceful life is. We would like rulers to provide a setting for us to live out our faith in that way. So I will stop there and see if you have questions or comments. We have about 5 to 10 minutes for that. Just remember, the more questions you ask, though, the longer we have till we get to the refreshments. No, please, I do enjoy question and answer. I learn a lot when I hear how people respond to some of the things I say. So please, go ahead.
This is a tough question. Are there limits to the libertarianism that Machen represented, given the fact that in 1913, D.B. Warfield overruled Princeton Seminary on black and white attending the same college, Machen wrote his mom, countering D.B. Warfield. If you're in an environment where Christianity is twisted to accommodate, let's say, segregation or apartheid,
Right.
and you want, in such a setting where government is run by a pseudo-Christian party who twists scripture for, let's say, segregation or apartheid, will libertarianism also be the right vehicle for a Christian in such a setting? Segregation in 64 in the state of London.
Well, I mean, first I would say that I think it's a little unfair to go from that letter to apartheid. I mean, that's a little bit, I mean, I know the issues are similar, but it's,
Let's keep it to segregation.
but I just think it's, Machen was a racist. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that. But it wasn't the case that these other political views that he was advocating stemmed from that. I don't know the history of politics in South Africa to know how much of that stemmed from apartheid or not. But that was a pretty big system in ways that what the rules governing dorm life at Princeton were pretty small in comparison. So I think that needs to be put out there. I actually don't understand why libertarianism wouldn't be a good thing in apartheid. If you had government really decrease its power and gave more liberty to all people, all races, all colors, and let them set up institutions and provide for their own institutions and reduce the size of the white governments. Why? I mean, again, this isn't necessarily the setting for me to learn it more about South African politics, but it seems to me that a small government, doesn't seem to me like apartheid was a small government. It wasn't an outworking of libertarianism. It was an outworking of something else. So it seems to me libertarianism might be something we're trying in that setting. Yeah. Yes?
If I'm just asking if, because of the live stream, if you've got a question, please come up to the mic and ask them so we can hear it on the recording.
Or I can just repeat the question. Why don't I do that?
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Hart.
Sure. Yes.
I know you appeal to, or you said Machen appealed to scripture and to the Reformed tradition in terms of total depravity as to why, and for his reasons for libertarianism and small government and so forth. What role would natural law have played in his thinking, and even maybe the positive use of it? Would he have appealed to that, or even brought that into his
Right.
thinking?
So the question is for anyone out there viewing via live stream, did Machen appeal in his understanding of libertarianism and politics and the like, did he make any use or appeal to natural law? I think the answer is no directly. I think he may have worked indirectly out of that kind of outlook, but I never saw any reference to it, to the phrase. I didn't see references to authors or writers who would have been prominent natural law people. I do think his views are compatible with that. I have lots of friends and colleagues who work in natural law thought, and it doesn't sound to me like it's anything that distinct, but no, he didn't use it directly, yeah. But this came up earlier in an informal conversation before we started. David Van Drunen, professor at Westminster, California, who was here in 2014, I guess, he has several books on natural law and two kingdoms, but his first book, Natural Law and Two Kingdoms, I think is very useful on the subject, and you may be familiar with it, but I also think he may spend some time on Machen in that, so that might be one place to look. Yes.
There is a passage in the Institutes where Calvin supports the idea of two kingdoms. And if one looks at the rationale of the Dutch Reformed churches in their support of apartheid, because there is a historical sense in which the ideology of apartheid was born in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a sense in which the churches, the Dutch Reformed churches based the argument for supporting apartheid on the idea of a doctrine of two kingdoms,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not they actually called it that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how would one draw the lines there in the sense of saying that one should have a distinction between the field of government and the field of the church, and yet to use the argument for a distinction or a separation justifies apartheid?
Right. So the question has to do with the appeals or the use that churches in South Africa made of two kingdoms,
Now, the Dutch Reformed Church.
Dutch Reformed churches, to two kingdoms in implementing or defending at least apartheid.
Promoting.
Okay, promoting it. I just don't know the literature on Dutch Reformed history here in South Africa to know. I'm not trying to dodge the question, because it doesn't seem to me in any way that it follows, if you're going to have church and state, church and government in two spheres or two kingdoms, as it were, that in any way inherently involves a separation of races. I don't see how that follows at all.
Well, the argument was that the Christian principles of unity between believers does not apply in the political area. In the political area, birds of a feather should flock together.
Right. But even then, you have people from both races in the political side, and you have people from both races in the church side. So the lines separating church and state, as it were, again, don't involve separating the races, since you have both races in both sides. So I mean, that gets then into questions about how you view human beings, human persons, the creation accounts, anthropology, and the like. And that seems to me a different order of reflection than, say, how civil government and church government relate. I could sort of imagine how those arguments might get worked out, but again, my awareness, it doesn't seem to follow. Now, I could just be, because of my own context in the United States, it seems relatively foreign, although we had segregation there too, and we had churches that tried to defend segregation. So it's not completely foreign to the United States. But even those arguments that I've read, it doesn't seem to follow from anything remotely, directly, inherently related to two kingdoms. It comes from something else, and then the two kingdoms can be used somehow to give cover for some kind of arrangement of it.
Maybe I should.
We could talk more, please. Yeah. All right. One more question.
Say something to what I believe, or just from what the examples that you've given, as I see it, Machen was being logically consistent between those examples, particularly the argument in terms of the intolerance in the church and tolerance outside of the church. I think those two are logically consistent because in order to preserve the purity of the church, you then need to protect it from the impurity of the government, which will then include unbelievers, and you also need to allow an exit strategy for heretics to go and form another church so that they can leave your church to be pure. So to me, those are logically consistent. But these other examples, you seem to be advocating freedom, which is or liberty. But I think that the word liberalism in different ages and eras can have different
Right.
meanings.
Yeah.
And also, I think the agenda in the sort of social gospel groups in Machen's time is quite different to what it is now.
Right.
And so it's, as I read it, he was being consistent in the way he was working it out, but somebody might disagree with him on a level of detail, but it seems to me logically consistent.
All right. That wasn't a question, but I will say for those listening who aren't present, Machen gets a passing grade from one of the people in the audience that he was consistent in his views here. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.